with an expert in charge and all these other people that have been flying airplanes, and they've all been flying in this area. It's not like this is their first time down there. They've all been learning. It's like this is like their backyard at this point.
Yeah.
So how did this go wrong? So it seems like at some point after they did the bombing run, Lieutenant Taylor starts doubting himself. He starts doubting his equipment. He starts thinking that his compass is wrong.
You are listening to the Solvable Mysteries podcast, episode number 21. My name is Juras, and as usual, I'm joined by my co-host, Glenn Heiko. How are you, man?
Fine. Happy New Year. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right, man. How was your New Year's celebration?
It was good. We stayed pretty busy. I got a lot of good pictures done, and I discovered a lost parakeet, but that's another mystery.
Oh yeah, I think I saw that on your Instagram or something like that.
Yeah,
Was
my
that
Facebook.
was it like that yellow parrot?
Yeah, that little. I guess my daughter said technically it was a budgie or something from like 5 minutes of research. But yeah, I was taking pictures of
Ooh.
hummingbirds in my parents' backyard, and all of a sudden this yellow thing flies by my head and lands on the ground, and then it didn't fly away, and we were like, oh, we were scared for it, but we didn't. It was friendly. We tried to get it warm and give it some water, but then it didn't stick around. It decided to go fly away again, and we didn't have a cage or anything. My kid was pretty upset because she wants a pet, but I didn't want to
Mm,
try to like
yeah, I mean
capture that thing. Yeah,
that sounds like a lot of work, and it probably
yeah.
belonged to someone else. That doesn't seem like a bird that would just be living out in the
No,
streets, you know?
it had a band on its leg,
Oh
so
yeah.
we're sure it was somebody's pet. Yeah, we're actually on next door trying to figure out. There's somebody that lost a pet that maybe it was
All
it,
right.
but it would have flown a long way. So
Mm.
anyway, yeah, there's another mystery for another episode.
I mean, but it ties into this week's episode because
Yeah,
we are talking about
lost
flying
flyers.
things. Yeah, lost flyers. So, without any further ado, today we are going to be talking about the mysterious Flight 19. So, just to give a brief context on what Flight 19 is, Flight 19 was the designation of a group of 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers. So, if I'm not mistaken, these are the torpedo bombers that were part of Flight 19, right? That we are seeing on the image right now.
Yeah, it's sort of the last era of torpedo bombers in terms of like this is right after the World War II, and
Right.
they're kind of an aircraft that were very much a product of their era, and were replaced not that long after this period by guided missiles. So this was sort
Yeah.
of the last hurrah for them.
Interesting. So on December 5th, 1945, so this incident happened right after the World War II, I guess. After losing contact during a United States Navy over water navigation training flight from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So let me just jump to the maps. So this was the, I guess, airport back in the day in 1945 that Flight 19 was, I guess, ascended from. So right now it's a commercial airport, right? It's called the Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport. And just to give you a quick context to where it actually is located, so it's like right by the shoreline, I guess. What I'm saying is like by the Florida coast. So essentially all 14 airmen of the flight were lost, as were all 13 crew members of a Martian BPM Mariner flying boat that subsequently launched from, I guess, a different naval air station called the Banana River to search for the missing Flight 19. So I guess the BPM aircraft was known to accumulate flammable gasoline vapors in its bilges, and professional investigators have assumed that the BPM most likely exploded in midair while searching for the flight, and Navy investigators could not determine the exact cause of the loss of Flight 19. So we actually have two separate flights that went missing on the same day. So if I'm not mistaken, if I understand this correctly. So this is quite the coincidence, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, it was probably a pretty embarrassing and distressful day for the Navy when it happened, and I think as we get into the case, it really justifies some of the decisions that were made, at which point they decided to cut their losses for, at least the day of the disappearance, why the Navy did what it did. So just to give some quick context about this case and why we chose it, you're us, when you and I were talking about what we wanted to cover next after our Madeline episode. This case has a little bit of a special place in my heart. And this goes back to when I was a little kid in the early 80s or mid 80s at my library. And I guess it was still the children's section it was interesting that this book was even there, but in the kids section of the library, there was a book called The Devil's Triangle. And, this is, I think, I was probably about 8 or 9. It was about the age when I started getting into, I guess, topics that were beyond little kid topics, starting to get into the like the age where you're starting to read, big kid books and adult books. So this book was sort of straddling that. Maybe it was a young adult book. It was about what was called the Devil's Triangle, what is also known as the Bermuda Triangle. And that's a theory that there's sort of this geographic area that's marked off by a triangle that's essentially over partially the Caribbean and the Atlantic and kind of straddling the Gulf a little bit. It's an area with really, really bad weather, but there's always been a lot of theories that maybe there was something more mysterious going on, that maybe there was like some kind of strange disturbances to compasses, or that somehow
some sort of a magnetic field that sort of makes all the compasses I guess break or something like that. I mean, that's like the general knowledge what I have.
Yeah, there was that. There were also some other historical disappearances besides this Flight 19. There was this one ship, a bulk freighter, that had something like 240 people on it, called the Cyclops, that disappeared entirely. And it had this kind of weird aura over the years based on some books that people had written, including the book I read, apparently, that, kind of put an air of mystery and paranormal. And it was even referred to in one of the Spielberg's movies, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. They basically insinuated that these disappearances were caused by UFOs. So there were, theories around that. It's kind of one of those fun, spooky things. Like, if you like spooky things,
which we do.
One of those, So, if you like spooky mysteries, this definitely fell in there. And I also remember around the same time when I was a kid, seeing something on PBS where they covered kind of the similar events. But so what, the long and short of it is, this was a case that was in this book, and it was pretty spooky because you had what were essentially expert pilots flying around and somehow lost, and nobody could find them. And it even seemed weird, like sometimes some of the quotes in the old books were like, it's almost like these guys were in another dimension. So it's like, there is a Twilight Zone aspect to it. Yeah, is one way to think about it. So, with that in mind, I thought, I'm really glad you decided to let me cover this today, because it is something that I find pretty intriguing, and they haven't solved it.
To interrupt you a little bit, this case is really fascinating to me because I have not heard of it before you've actually mentioned this particular case, because I have been aware of the more modern, I guess, flight disappearances that happened in like recent years that are also unexplained, and we can definitely cover them in future episodes. But I mean, this case was fascinating because I find everything like back from the like 40s, 50s, like this more like retro technology that we are seeing right now, on the screen. When it malfunctions or when it goes missing, I think it's definitely fascinating. And the fact that it happened somewhere around like the Bermuda Triangle area, it definitely captured my attention. However, I definitely feel that you are the expert on this case because you have been following it for, I guess, years now, like for almost like half your life since you heard of it, when you were like a young kid. So I think you can definitely provide us with like some more interesting information. So yeah, I'll just definitely let you, I guess, tell us the story of Flight 19, and I will provide my comments here and there, but I feel like you're really the more knowledgeable person here.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's been something that's been on my own personal radar for about 35 years. So it certainly is something that I relish being able to discuss and cover now, even after all those years. So as you mentioned, the location of the case we're talking about today was an air base formerly known as Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, and it was a training base for the Navy. Apparently, it was a training base that specialized for a specific kind of aircraft, which was the PBM Avenger. It's worth mentioning that this aircraft type
Yeah.
has quite a distinguished history. It was, quite a prominent weapon during World War II. It took a lot of losses. It didn't necessarily, let's say, do a lot of damage. I mean, it did, of course, do its part, but it also got shot down a lot. It was during, this transitional era where carrier warfare was being defined, and sometimes weapon systems that seem really good on paper, when you actually get them into combat around all these other weapon systems, they can get shot down a lot. But it was an impressive aircraft. Certainly, I think it was the kind of aircraft that when you're trying to teach young pilots or beginning pilots how to fly an aircraft and have them learn the right way. It's almost like if you were teaching a kid how to ride a bike,
Yeah.
don't give them like the super light frame mountain bike. Give him like him or her, the big solid framed stainless steel bike that's heavy, that makes them really work for it and develop those muscles. I think it was that kind of aircraft. So there were some pretty prominent people that went on to bigger things in life that flew this airplane. So I'm thinking of George H.W. Bush, so Daddy Bush, the first recent President Bush, the father of W. He flew that aircraft and was actually shot down in that aircraft, and
was he?
he almost died in that aircraft. Yeah, that's a whole other story into itself, where he got shot down, and the two guys that were crew members with him, they died. He didn't. He was in the water. He was about to get captured by the Japanese when a U.S. submarine turned up and whisked him away. So he had almost lost his life there and not gone on to, I guess, the greatness that he had. It's also worth mentioning that Paul Newman, he wanted to be a pilot, but he couldn't. He had, I think, color blindness, so he was a rear gunner on this same aircraft type.
I see, because you cannot, I guess, pilot an airplane if you're color blind, right? That would probably cause some sort of complications, I would assume.
At least back then, I know, especially for carrier landings for the Navy, there's a special visual signal you need to look at when you're landing, and you need to be able to see red versus green. So I think that.
That's probably hard. Now I'm thinking about like colorblind people driving cars and like stopping at like red, the stop signs or anything
the wrong
like
color
that.
lights. Yeah, so it's pretty, back then they weren't taking a lot of chances, and as we'll see, flying back then was pretty dangerous, even with perfect vision. So, this aircraft, it was originally meant to deliver either torpedoes against ships. So if you imagine this thing would swoop down on an enemy ship and try to drop a torpedo aimed at the path of where the ship was going.
So these are the torpedoes, right?
Those.
No, these are like probably bombers.
Those look like bombs. So that so to your point, I think the B in PBM Avenger, I think that's torpedo bomber fighter. So it could actually if wasn't holding a torpedo, it could hold something like 2,000 pounds worth of bombs. So
I see.
I'm assuming that's 400 or 500 pound bombs, 4x 400 pound bombs. So it was a pretty
Is this
nice
is this
delivery
the
platform.
is this the inside of the bomber plane that we're talking about, or am I looking at something?
Oh yeah, maybe that might be one of the stations. I'm not sure if that's because so there was a 3-person crew.
Mm-hmm.
There's a pilot, there's a rear gunner, and I think there's a navigator or a bombardier or something like that. There's
Yeah.
just a lot to do in those days. They didn't have any computers really, so
Oh yeah, yeah.
everything's manual and
Because I'm not sure if this is the same plane, but like you can see
yeah,
multiple people manning the plane, and it definitely I guess it reminds me of those, I guess, dogfight planes from like the World War II footage. You know what I'm saying? It has like the same sort of big motor on the
yeah,
front. Propeller, is that what
yep,
it's called? Yeah,
yep.
so they have like that big propeller, and I always thought that these planes look the coolest to me. Like they look cooler than the modern planes, just because like they're so raw, like
Raw power. Yeah, this thing
yeah.
had some kind of mass. I think it had like a 2,000 horsepower engine, something like that.
God damn.
It had a very powerful engine for the frame. They're very loud. I live near an airport where there's a group of people that fly an aircraft that's similar in size to this, not the same aircraft,
Hmm.
but yeah, when they start doing their thing, you can really hear them. So yeah, nowadays I think they refer to this era as the warbirds.
Yeah.
These are just kind of the classic era of aviation, maybe the golden era of aviation after
Hmm.
World War One. So yeah, there was this training flight. There's a flight leader, so there is an instructor we're going to talk about
Yep.
today. His name is Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, and he had something like 2,500 hours in this type of aircraft. I think he'd been a instructor for about 3 years at this point. 2,500 hours is a very significant amount of time in an aircraft. That's something that, if you look at military pilots today,
Yeah.
if they've hit 2,500 hours in an aircraft, they're considered to be an expert
Oh
in
yeah,
that
yeah.
aircraft.
That I bet, because getting like I guess 2,500 hours at your, like, I don't know, regular work sort of is a challenge. So like getting that amount and, like, I guess the flight time, that's crazy, because pilots don't fly all the time. So that definitely
Yeah.
seems like he has. So he was probably in the Second World War, right? He probably had a lot of military operations, right?
I was trying to remember when I did the research. It sounds like they might have just put him straight into being an instructor. So sometimes if someone is a good enough pilot,
Yeah.
where they're like, you know what, it would be a waste. You're such a good pilot that it would be a waste to have you get shot down in some mission right away. We'd rather have you apply your expertise and
I see. So
your fine level of skill.
I just want to ask like a question,
Yeah.
because like you probably know a lot more about this. So back in the day, like back in World War II days, being like a fighter pilot was almost like a suicide mission. Am I right? Or because like did they have like the I guess ejection capabilities, where like you eject from the plane and then you can still
No.
parachute? Nothing like that, right?
Well, I mean, they had parachutes. So, I mean, just as a side note, my
Okay.
grandfather was in the Army Air Force, that's what they used to call the Air Force before it was called the Air Force, the Army
Mm-hmm.
Air Force.
Yeah.
And he wasn't a pilot or anything. He was a crew member, so he was a side machine gunner.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I believe he had to parachute out when his bomber got shot down. He was a side machine gunner in a B-17. But so yeah, I mean, you could bail out. Certainly, there were plenty of people that could bail out. But yeah, it was whether or not you could actually get the canopy open and whether you weren't already shot. And yeah, there were just tons of aviators who died either in their own aircraft or while getting shot down because they never got out of the airplane,
Yeah.
or even if they could get out of the airplane, if they didn't parachute out, if you hit the water, it was like hitting a brick wall. So,
Oh
there
yeah.
were,
Yeah.
or you could parachute out of the airplane and end up either breaking your neck on the ground or ending up in the water and get eaten by sharks before you got rescued.
I
So,
mean, it's a rough job.
yeah.
Especially, it would seem like a cool job, just to be like flying around for fun, but when it's actually go time, when it's like wartime and you have to like fight against the Nazis and and
Yeah.
the Italians and the Japanese, because the Japanese were from like what I've gathered, they had their aviation set up fairly nicely during that time, World War II.
Yeah.
They were, I guess, they were even crazier with the planes, I guess, with the kamikaze planes and stuff like that. But yeah, it's a rough job, but somebody had to do it. So I guess the Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor was one of the guys that decided, flying is going to be my thing, I guess.
Yeah, he was one of those people that put their neck on the line, to your point. And, there was, to your other point about the Japanese being experts much earlier in the war, about, aviation specifically and carrier aviation, so naval aviation. Yeah, we had a real heavy effort we had to put in terms of getting everybody up to speed. And I think that, by the end of the war, so by the time this thing happens, we have a pretty good training machine in place, a pretty good program. But, unfortunately, to make an omelet, you've got to break some eggs. And we certainly were breaking a lot of eggs in terms of training accidents and, mechanical failures and things like that. And I think, unfortunately, you're going to see some of that in this case. So, in the case of Lieutenant Taylor, he had a class underneath him. So he had, several other planes, and these were, interestingly, some of these folks, they were about to have to do their final training exercise before graduation. So they were scheduled to graduate right after this exercise. And interestingly, as I was looking through the list of crew, the people flying the airplane, it was a whole mixture of people. So some of the people were like you said, I mean, there were actually some people who were actual combat veterans, either from, other branches of the service, and then decided to go into aviation. There was one guy who was actually a captain and basically demoted himself so he could get into aviation and, become a pilot. So he had actually gone off in some whole other branch of the service and wanted to see the action, and he was the only married.
So that would be I guess, a lower rank position to be a starting pilot than a captain, right?
Well, yeah. So that was a weird thing. Was that captain is about three rungs up. So it goes like second lieutenant, first lieutenant, captain, and he actually, and I might be wrong because I think the Navy might even have some other weird ones in there like commander. So he might have actually been 4 ranks up. But yeah, interestingly enough, he actually outranked Lieutenant Taylor, but Lieutenant Taylor was still in charge of the class
because
he was instructor.
You can't like let a guy who's like really good in terms of like ground combat, sort of lead an aviation team. But yeah, I guess I could see why he decided to make the move. Maybe after the Second World War, he decided that he pretty much seen everything there is to see in terms of ground combat, and he wanted to experience the flight game as well. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and then you would think that right there at the end of the war too, it would at least be somewhat safer because you're not really facing the prospect anymore of immediately having to fly into the Pacific and chase after enemy carriers anymore or get shot down.
Also, a quick question to you: did they have because this is gonna I'm really oblivious in terms of like the logistics of like the 1940s. So did they have like commercial planes flying regularly on the regular basis back in the day, like passenger planes, or was it not developed yet?
No, it was really rare. It was something at that point, to your point, commercial aircraft, especially because all the resources were going to the war.
Okay.
Like before the war, there was some commercial flight, but it was for the really rich. It was for the 1%, let's say.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the kind of the great thing, the silver lining, I guess, about the war was that the war got us all really good at making planes and figuring out what planes wouldn't crash. So after this, there were a lot of leftover planes. There's actually still planes from this war that were cargo planes that are being used in other parts of the world because that's how long they've lasted.
Oh wow, yeah,
So yeah, yeah,
I heard some are
has like
being used
commercial
in like
planes.
Africa and stuff like that, in like the
Yeah,
poorer countries, because the infrastructure is not there yet, so they need to like transport goods by air, I guess. So yeah, I've definitely heard about that. So I mean, that
yeah,
just I guess that just shows you how reliable these things were made right back in the day, because like all the countries focused on were like military, I guess, technology. So I guess when you focus all of your energy, all of your time in a certain direction, you're gonna provide some sort of a good quality technology, most likely. So I guess that's what happened during the Second World War.
yeah, they're definitely built to last and built tough. And if anything, they're probably really good for developing nations that might not be able to make like a really long runway or even a paved runway. Like a dirt runway is
Hmm.
still good for some of these aircraft. So yeah, they're definitely, it was an era where all countries made tremendous strides in aviation technology, and it really was the golden era of aviation that allows us to enjoy the aeronautical technology we have today.
Cool.
So there is a flight that this class needs to do before they graduate. It's what seems like a pretty simple uh, exercise. It's called navigation problem number 1, and all it really is a big triangle. So in this exercise, uh, they are going to take off out of the base. They're going to head east at 91 degrees, and in between where they took off in the Bahamas, there's something called Chicken Shoals where they're going to drop some bombs because they're bombers.
Yeah.
So they're gonna drop some bombs, and they're gonna keep on going. And at some point, based on the speed they're flying, at least as indicated on their
Hmm.
equipment and their clocks or watches, because it turned out that a bunch of the planes were missing clocks, which seems amazing. And this is before GPS, so everything really was based on a combination of, paying close attention to the clock or your watch, and
Hmm.
everybody had a watch, and looking at the meters. And I, a lot of our listeners and viewers may not know this, but what the gauge says in your airplane,
Hmm.
especially before GPS, what the gauge says is really just measuring how fast the wind is going by your plane. It might not actually tell you how fast the ground, what's called your ground speed, is going past your plane. So did that make sense? Your indicated airspeed is very different than your ground speed. So
I mean, to a casual listener, to a casual, person in terms of like airplanes, like myself, the gauge
yeah,
is a mystery. It's a complete mystery to me. I mean, I sort of know that this thing probably indicates the level, sea
yeah.
level that you're at. I assume this is the speed, and this is supposed to be the compass. And it looks really confusing to someone like myself. So I
And it is,
mean,
it
yeah,
is, it is, it is complex. So it is,
very
flying can
complex.
be, yeah, flying is a combination of very easy things and very difficult things. And that's, I think, where the danger lies. So yeah, just really quickly, when you drive
Yeah.
your car is basically counting the number of times your tires turn and figuring out how fast you're going based on that.
Okay.
It knows roughly, like, okay, your tire turns 60 times in a 10 seconds, that equals X amount of kilometers or miles per hour.
Hmm.
So for an airplane, there's not really a way it can do that. It can't really measure the ground, at least not before GPS and all the computers. So especially,
Ah, I see. Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
what I mean? In these old days, so what it would have instead is little instruments inside that measure how fast the wind is going by. So the wind is whooshing at a certain rate, and it says, okay, well the thing is, depending on how high you are, there might be more or less air going by your little meter there, right? So
Hmm.
like, if you're at a lower altitude, there's more air, and when you're at a higher altitude, there's less air. So there really is like a complex calculation that needs to be done, especially in these old days, between like, okay, I'm at this height, so there's less air, so the meter is saying one thing, but our ground speed is really another thing. So that was
Hmm.
I think part of this whole exercise was just getting good at that, for understanding like, okay, you're flying at this height for this amount of time, how many miles did you go? And that was the
Okay.
whole point of this exercise, was to do this big triangle. So they were supposed to fly out do a bombing run, keep going straight, hit the Bahamas, cut north for another distance, and then eventually complete the triangle by flying back to Florida and landing at their base. So they're making this, this triangle, and it seems like, despite some of the
Hmm.
complexities, these guys all should have been good at this. I mean, the students at this point have had potentially a couple hundred hours of
Right.
flight time, and Charles Taylor has 2,500 hours of flight time, and the flight time is just the flight time. They also spend classroom time and logistical and
Hmm.
planning time. Like, this is not the first time they've ever done this. This is supposed to be the last time they do it before they go out and do it for their job.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's interesting. I just wanted to mention a few points before we actually move on with the story. So, to me personally, while I was researching, and maybe you can give your take on this as well, I found it really weird that none of the, I guess, clocks on any of the planes worked. At least that's what I researched,
Yeah.
and they sort of assumed that all of the pilots had watches, like wrist watches, or I assume something like that. So that was really interesting to me. Like, if timing is so important, to not like double check the, if everyone has the capability to tell time accordingly. That's weird to me. I mean, it could be explained by the fact that maybe it was a hectic schedule, and they did it for so many times before, so that it just didn't seem like they did something that you need to double check. But at least for me, that would seem like an error that should be solved before trying to fly somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It is a little bit shocking, but then I just read an article in between when we picked this topic and when, right now, I read an article that even recently a Marine squadron that had a fatal accident
Hmm.
had kind of a similar, if anything, actually a worse situation where a lot of the parts they needed, and this is now, when we're not in wartime and when we're not really strapped for resources and parts and things. Apparently, it's just one of those things that happens when you have a big organization with a lot of mechanical pieces and parts, and especially just coming out of the war when a lot of things were still hard to come by. Yeah, it doesn't seem ideal, but maybe in a way they kind of looked at it and they're like, well, this is part of your training, because when you go out in the carrier, you're going to have the same situation where you need to go bomb that ship, but not everything's perfect. So, yeah, live with it. But I do believe
That's
it.
still a crazy, crazy way to go
It's kind of
about it.
harsh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. So I mean, the reality was they do kind of this pre-flight check right before they leave, and yeah, they're like, I think like three of them are missing clocks, and maybe that was part of the problem. But I don't think that ultimately that was necessarily the main issue here,
Hmm.
though it certainly probably did contribute. I believe that aviators pride themselves in having really nice watches. Like, that's kind of like, it's sort of
I see.
the
I
big
see.
selling point around, yeah, aviator watches. So maybe that's where that comes from, is just the reality was they couldn't trust the ship to have a good clock. And here's the other thing
Okay. Yeah.
is maybe the watch that's on your wrist is more dependable anyway, because at least
Right.
how reliable that thing is, and you've been winding it, and that thing that's connected to the, I don't know, connected to the power system in your plane. What if your plane loses power? Well, then you've lost your clock. So maybe you were always supposed to have at least one redundant
I
source
mean,
of
yeah,
telling.
especially since the airplanes were manned by three-man crew, I guess. So you would definitely expect someone on the plane to have a watch that was working. So I guess I see why that's not. Right now I'm thinking about it. Okay, it's important to have a working clock on the airplane, but at the same time, it's probably not that necessary, because you have three people on, or three, I guess, not necessarily pilots, but like at least three crew member on the plane. So it probably someone definitely had a watch at that time. So right,
Yeah.
the whole malfunctioning watches on the airplane thing, I just found it fascinating. But maybe these planes were not checked up regularly, so on a regular basis. So I guess that's what happened. So yeah, I guess we can move
Yeah.
on.
Yeah, the beat up training aircraft that get a lot
Mm.
of use and see a lot of abuse. So yeah, and then plus, like to your point, there's 3 people in the airplane, all of who have a vested interest to get home alive, and then you multiply that times 5 airplanes in this case for the flight. So it's 15 people that have an interest, and you would think would be able to collectively figure out how fast they're going, how far they went, and how to get home. In this case, it's only 14 people because one of the crew members got out of the exercise for a reason that seems somewhat unknown, but yeah,
Yeah.
didn't end up doing the exercise, so he essentially missed his own doom in this case. So yeah, so they go and they do the exercise, and after they do the bombing run, at some point right around the time that they would have made the turn north.
So you're talking about the
Yeah.
first. If you can see the map, I'm not sure if if you can see the map, Glenn. But are you talking about
Yep.
this turn, right? Okay.
Yeah, so there's the first leg. So they do the first leg, they do the bombing run, and then right at the first corner of the triangle there, they're supposed to turn north and head north for a little while, and then it seems pretty foolproof, right? Then you make a left turn again, you head west again, and you hit Florida. So how could
Yeah.
that go wrong? So,
Yeah.
especially with an expert in charge and all these other people that have been flying airplanes, and they've all been flying in this area. It's not like this is their first time down there. They've all been learning. It's like this is like their backyard at this point.
Yeah.
So, how did this go wrong? So, it seems like at some point after they did the bombing run, Lieutenant Taylor starts doubting himself. He starts doubting his equipment. He starts thinking that his compass is wrong because he sees an island in a place where he doesn't expect it. So he starts to doubt, he starts to wonder if maybe his compass, and it's not impossible. And I guess maybe this is why people sometimes come up with the Bermuda Triangle theory that something is turning compasses off. But I think it isn't always anything that mysterious. Sometimes compasses just get screwed up.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's almost like he had like a panic attack at like the wrong time, at the exact wrong time when he was leading a bunch of other people who were looking to him to be the expert. But it sounds like he thought that instead of going west, that somehow they had gone south. So if that makes sense,
Yeah.
he's
So
thinking,
he's
yeah,
thinking
he's
that
thinking,
they actually, right at this corner right here, they were supposed to go north. So he's probably thinking that they accidentally went south, right, towards the Bahamas. So that's
yeah, that they
his,
got
I guess,
turned
mental.
around
Yeah.
somehow.
Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, when he starts looking at the islands underneath him, and once again, I can see, I'm not a pilot. My only flying has been,
Mm-hmm.
flight simulators. But even in those things, you can get turned around, and I can see where something, especially if you're panicking or
Mm-hmm.
in bad weather, and that's the other thing that's going on is, as the afternoon is getting worse, the weather is getting worse, and at certain altitudes, the weather eventually reaches hurricane force
Mm-hmm.
winds. So it's possible that his visibility is starting to deteriorate as the evening is getting longer. But it sounds like he thought that he was actually even further south. It sounds like he thought that somehow he got so off course that he was down in the Florida Keys. So what we're talking about is way down to the south of Florida. If you follow Florida all the way south,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you follow that peninsula, there's a whole string of little islands.
So you're talking about like the
Yeah,
Key
way down
West,
there.
something like that. Uh,
Yeah, so he thought, so here's what his worry is. His worry is
yeah.
that if, I guess he was worried that his compass went wrong, and even if everyone else's compass is working right, he's worried that for that last leg, that westward leg, he's worried that if his theory is correct, and he seems to really jump to a conclusion here, but he's worried that if he goes west at that point, you're just going to end up in the Gulf of Mexico and not towards land. So
Yeah, yeah,
does that
yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense because he's probably thinking that he's heading towards the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, now it makes sense. Yeah, like south of Florida, I guess.
Yeah, so then this obviously causes some consternation, not just with his students who all want to get home alive tonight, but also from some of the people at the naval base and even other pilots from the Navy who are flying around who are starting to hear the ever-growing panic of conversation between him and his flight, his flight of students. And this is where it starts to get pretty interesting, especially in the analysis, because they're trying to offer help. Like you might ask yourself, well, how did they navigate? And this for sure wasn't the first time anyone ever got lost at sea or lost in the air. So how did people find their ways? And there are things like radio beacons and navigational beacons, especially now. There's kind of a whole series of. They don't just rely on GPS. If your GPS breaks and you're a pilot,
what's a radio beacon again? Because like
yeah. So it just operates on like the principle of if you had like a radio station
mhm.
that was making a strong signal, and if you have a directional antenna, so an antenna that only
that
picks up,
yeah yeah
you know what I mean?
yeah
If I point this way, I don't get the radio station. If I point
okay
towards the radio station, then I'm getting a signal, and I point away. It's an easy way of saying,
mhm.
hey, if I know this radio station is in Miami,
Yeah.
then I
Oh,
can use the
oh,
directional
now, yeah,
antenna. You know what I mean? And
that's smart. That's
find
smart.
true
Yeah.
west. Yeah, because this way, even if like I can't see the sun or I can't tell what
Yeah.
direction I'm going, I don't trust my compass. So like these other pilots are trying to urge him on to use this equipment. They're saying, hey, you're on this frequency right now and you're talking to your crew. Why don't you just switch to this other frequency? And actually what we'll do is if you turn on this other frequency, we can try to hone in on you. And that's actually what they did eventually, was they were able to figure out that he was probably where he was supposed to be, and that he was probably just having a big panic attack. But unfortunately, this is an era where radio technology is still fairly primitive. I mean, this is only 20 years into the era where people had radios at home.
God damn, that's
You know what I
crazy.
mean?
That's
This is like,
that's insane.
yeah.
I mean, another interesting fact here. I mean, I'm going a little bit off topic here, but just to like, I guess, food for the mind is crazy. Like, think about like late 19th century and the early 20th century. How much innovation happened, in like the span of like 50 years. People went from not even conceiving that a man could ever like fly in the sky with some sort of an apparatus. I'm not sure when cars were like developed for the first time or anything like that, but you know what I'm saying, like in the 50 60 years, something like that, so much innovation had happened. So to us right now, looking, we all have these like safety checks, safety precautions in airplanes, in cars, in everything. Back in the day, these were just like, I guess, first models of modern like machinery, so they didn't really
Oh
have
yeah.
anything. They were like really just going like raw at it.
Yeah, it's true. When you had multiple versions of that, it wasn't just like one technology. Like right now, we have smartphones, and we have a hard enough time kind of figuring out how to balance our lives and structure life around online. But it was like it was the equivalent of
Yeah.
having several different breakthrough technology at once. So flying machines plus radios that were still pretty new
hmm
technology. They didn't even really have, I don't think, FM radio yet. So these are all like AM radios, uh, and the signals are really weird with that kind of radio. So like sometimes the signal
Yeah.
could be really really weak close to it, but then somebody half the country away could pick it up. In fact, there were people that were flying in fighters in Europe, and then when they got retired out to the United States while their friends were still fighting the war,
hmm
they could actually tune in the station with their radio and hear their friends all the way in Europe
Whoa.
from the United States. Yeah. I mean, I've even done that with my radio
That's
scanner. In California, certain times of the year, the radio signals will actually skip off of the atmosphere. So I've heard stations all the way in the East Coast from my radio scanner here in the West Coast, from like certain police stations in the AM band, or let's say the low megahertz
so you can
FM
just
band.
so if you're a criminal, you can just like set up one of those I guess radio stations up, and you can like sort of listen in on the police. Is that like still possible to this day?
Oh yeah. No, it's still possible.
That's
Yeah,
crazy. I mean,
even now.
I guess that's how you're right. That's how the, I guess, cartels operate. Like that's what I've heard. Like they listen on like the border patrol constantly, right? just to
Oh,
hear
absolutely.
like yeah, I guess.
Yeah, same thing for professional robbery crews do too. They
Okay,
listen.
yeah.
Yeah, it's it's amazingly easy. So yeah, so it's a very frustrating era for technology because they're still figuring everything out. And yeah, in this case, the long and short of it was they could not seem to get the flight, which was in the middle of its own panic, to figure out
Mm-hmm.
to figure out like how to get back. And what happens is they end up doing a bunch of zigzags. So they keep second guessing themselves. It
Mm-hmm.
sounds like at one point they were flying west as if they were hoping that their compasses were right and that they were in the right place. And then Taylor keeps on thinking that he's right, that they were over the Florida Keys, that they're way further south, that they're, 100 something miles off where they should be. And then he keeps trying to steer them north and east, which, if you look at where they were supposed to be, north and east is not heading towards Florida. That's heading out into the open ocean. And that's probably
Oh
the
yeah.
wrong
Oh yeah.
direction. So,
So I mean, just before we move forward, like
yeah.
we are seeing this map right now. Do you think this is the correct map? Because I have seen like multiple, I guess, maps indicating where Flight 19 actually went. So would this seem like a rational explanation in terms of like where they were actually heading towards?
Yeah, I think so, especially given the way he was panicking. And then they even, so as they're broadcasting their signals, some of the people on the Navy side are like, "Hey, let's if they won't hone in on our signal,
Mm-hmm.
let's at least try to home in on theirs with our directional antennas." And they were relatively sure, like they weren't the signals weren't coming from the south. They were coming from,
The
let's say, north and
northeast,
east.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So
Yeah.
so yeah, so then the other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, the weather is starting to get worse, and one of these pilots who's trying to talk to Taylor and help guide him in, one of the other instructors, this guy named Cox, he actually offered to go out there and try to go fly and find him, and the Navy's like, you know what, no, buddy, we've got enough stuff going on already. You go ahead, and the weather's getting worse. You stay there. We're going to scramble some other folks. So they scramble a couple of these flying boats, and right away, one of these flying boats was called PBM 5. It's just this
Mm-hmm.
really big kind of hulk of a boat. If you look at it, it's what they call it, a flying boat, because that's what it is. And a boat like that, incidentally, as you were mentioning, a boat like that is a perfect kind of boat to pick up somebody who's crashed in an airplane. Um,
Exactly, right?
so yeah, because it can land in the water, you can jump in. Boats like that saved all kinds of people who had to jump
Mm-hmm.
out of their airplanes.
A,
So
a quick question before we move on. Like,
yeah,
were these boats like safe? Because like back in the, I guess, mid 40s, having an airplane that could land on water seemed like these planes probably crashed a lot. Like,
yeah, they still do.
yeah.
You can find some cool videos. Well,
Well,
not
yeah,
not
not
cool,
not that cool, I guess. Yeah,
yeah,
but yeah.
not cool to whoever's in it, but I'm certainly striking. I guess visually striking
Okay,
of people
yeah.
with these where if you don't land it quite right, you can flip over, and
It
anytime
just
you land
seems
something
it just
on
seems crazy to have something like this where you could like land on water. I mean, this is almost like alien technology, but I guess that's another
it
topic
looks
right
like a
there.
duck. Yeah,
Exactly, right?
it's really weird. Yeah, so they scramble some of these because what happened was, as Taylor's flight starts running out of gas, and his crew members are even starting to fight with him. They're like, we should just go west, and why are we listening to this guy? But they, to their credit, and unfortunately to their ultimate doom, they followed military discipline, and they listened to the boss, and the boss said do this, so they did this. So at some point they realized these guys are going to 100% crash into the water, and Taylor even goes down, says, hey, when the first plane starts going down, we're all going to go down together. So that's kind of scary, that like when the first plane runs out of gas, the rest of us are also going to crash. Like try to land in the water, but like we, instead of even, like you said, parachuting out, they're not going to do that. They're actually going to, which I think is more dangerous, try to land an airplane that wasn't meant to land in the water into the water, where like you can't get to a speed. There's a certain speed called stall speed where the airplane generate enough lift to stay in the air anymore, so it'll crash.
Yeah.
And essentially, that speed is higher than what would be safe to land in the water, if that
But
makes
that's
sense. So
but
when
that's but that's a crazy decision. Why would they decide
right,
not to jump out with air I guess parachutes if they have them? Why would they
yeah,
decide to crash the planes into the water? I mean, I'm pretty sure that that makes the planes explode. At least that's what I've that's what I've seen in like video
yeah,
games and stuff like that.
they go cartwheeling, and it's just, yeah, it's very destructive. It's really hard to understand. It may be there's sort of, they may have been more afraid of jumping out of the airplane than doing it that way. But I think it
I
was,
see.
like, to your point, the wrong decision. But yeah, they're hoping, though. They're hoping, hey, maybe these guys landed in the water safely, and they're just sitting there floating in the water in their life jackets, and we can go get them. So they send out one of these flying planes, and right away they lose radio contact with one of these airplanes, and a ship that's nearby in the water says, "Oh yeah, we saw a big explosion over that way." Right around the time you said that you couldn't
Yeah.
get radio contact with that flying boat anymore, and that way there goes 13 more people. So this is already turning into a big mess of a night for the Navy as the weather gets worse and the winds whip up, and they have some other
Mm-hmm.
airplanes trying to search, but it's not going well. So um, after all this happened, the next day they launch a massive search. I think it was the biggest peacetime search they'd ever done. It might have even been the biggest wartime search. It was something like 240 airplanes looking for any kind of survivors, any kind of wreckage. And they were doing, just complete grid searches. They're searching hundreds of square miles of ocean, and uh, they never found anything. So
Hmm.
the initial thing. So then we get into, okay, what happened during this investigation, because the Navy, obviously, they lost a substantial amount of people and airplanes in a period when they didn't expect this to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
what happened next? So um, the Navy does a big long report. It gets a little bit political because at some point Lieutenant Taylor's mother feels like they're scapegoating her son too much, and I guess they decide they don't want to embarrass her too much, so they sort of soften some of the conclusions afterwards. It's a little bit weird.
Right, because from what I've researched, at first, like the military sort of explained the disappearance of Flight 19 as part of bad judgment on, on Captain Charles Carroll Taylor. So I mean Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor. So essentially, I guess from what I've gathered, the military sort of wanted to like make this I guess news story die down as quickly as possible. So they just sort of try to explain it that this man was sort of the reason for the crash, or like the for what actually happened to Flight 19. But at the same time, when you think about it from the perspective that this guy had like 2.5 thousand hours of flight time, it would seem highly unlikely that he would make such a beginner's mistake, you would almost say, because the I guess the weather was pretty good, right? At least at the beginning of the flight. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it just, I guess it shows you that anybody can have a panic attack or a really bad day at work, which, it just seems so unlikely, but yet it certainly seems to have happened here, where he kept on mistaking his position, and he kept he kept changing his mind too
Hmm.
often. So I would say
Yeah,
that was part of the problem, was he didn't
yeah.
stick with what was probably the best course of action. He
Hmm.
he instead sort of changed his mind and then doubled down on what was certainly an alternative explanation to what was going on. So he wasn't really listening to feedback from his own students and from even people trying to communicate with him on the shore, and investigators felt that he was probably, even though they haven't found the aircraft yet, he was probably exactly where he was supposed to be and just was panicking. So then the other thing is, I know there's a sort of a stereotype about men. And I probably fit this stereotype about men not liking to ask for directions. Do you know that? Do you know that
Not really,
stereotype?
man. I
No.
mean, maybe we don't have that here in Europe. I mean, I've never heard about that
Yeah.
one, but like,
Okay. Yeah.
since we have like Google Maps, I don't think that's like no longer the case. Like, I would never find
Yeah.
myself asking for directions like in my life. But,
I would, I would, I would say
but yeah.
before Google Maps and before GPS, that was, I mean, to the point where you can find just endless comics, like newspaper comics making fun of it. That there's a stereotype that
Oh, I
men,
see. Yeah, we
you know what
see.
I mean?
Like, I never seen those comics because, like, I pretty much grew up with like at least GPS. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a stereotype about men that we will often spend hours lost instead of just stopping to ask somebody for directions, while women often have no problem and do not feel any kind of bruise to their ego for asking someone, "Hey, would you mind?" And it's true. I mean, even at the store, like
Yeah.
I would much rather just try to find it myself than even just ask somebody where something is. But so I almost think like maybe this is an example of that, where men kind of want to do it themselves and go their own way, and no, I can do it. I'm a I'm a big boy, I can do it. And like clearly in this point, he should have probably swallowed some of his pride and ego and asked for help, even though as an instructor, it probably made it even harder for him to do
Exactly.
that because he was supposed to be the expert. So I think that was a problem. The radio stuff we talked about, that was a big problem in terms of both coordinating what frequency to be on and trying to it was an era where for sure it was not easy to switch frequencies very quickly. It
Yeah.
was I don't even know that these airplanes had like airplanes right now, like fighters have sometimes 2 to 4 different radios that they can be on different frequencies on. I don't think that was the case back then. I think they had 1, maybe 2, and one of those might have been like a navigational radio
I
frequency.
see. I see. So, I mean, just to get this,
Yeah.
straight, did the compasses actually malfunction on the airplanes? Because like that was like the big thing that all of the, I guess, or most of the, I guess, compasses malfunction, and that was like the main reason what caused, I guess, them to panic. But
Yeah,
was that the case? Because like I guess that
I don't
during my research, I guess that was like emphasized a lot. So I'm not really sure where to stand on this.
Yeah, I think there was because of it. There were a couple of authors who made claims in the Bermuda and Devil's Triangle books that, as I researched this, and it was a little bit for like the part of me that really wanted this to be a mysterious, spooky thing. It turned out that a lot of the scholarship about what people had claimed in these books was wrong. That there was some amount of like basically lies or misleading statements in a lot of books about the Bermuda Triangle and the Devil's Triangle that were wrong. So it sounds like really it was Taylor's compass in his head was wrong because he saw the wrong thing out his window. It probably was just that like their timing was a little bit off in terms of where they thought they were, and they probably I mean, compasses certainly deviate a little bit because of magnetic differences in magnetic north versus true north, and that's not unusual for compasses, depending where you are on the Earth, to be a little bit off. So I think it was more his misjudgment and him panicking versus an actual problem with the compasses, because it seemed like the compasses were working in the other airplanes,
Yeah.
and he wasn't listening to them.
Okay,
Yeah,
so this was mainly, yeah, so that definitely would explain your sort of theory on the fact that he probably had a large ego. I mean, for someone who was an expert flyer at that point, at 2,500 hours flight time, it would seem like he would probably be really macho about this whole situation and just try to solve everything by himself, because like maybe even he thought that was not even his ego. Maybe he really believed that was like the best course of action, to like try to save everyone on his own merit, not really trying to listen to anyone else, because he maybe believed that these guys were not experienced enough, and maybe they will lead them to certain doom, and he was the only guy who could like save the flight 19 from meeting its I guess end. But clearly that did not happen. So right, so we are discrediting the Bermuda Triangle theory, right? Because like I don't really have a strong opinion on like what actually happened to the flight 19. So the Bermuda Triangle,
Yeah.
I guess, was sort of on my radar, but now that you explained to me that there were like exaggerations made, right, and most of the compasses actually did work on the other flights, on the other I guess bomber planes. So I guess I'm discrediting the Bermuda Triangle as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would have wanted it to be something spooky like that, certainly. I have almost the same reaction to this as I had to the Rendlesham case that we did, where I really wanted it to be something that was more spooky and more mysterious, but instead it kind of, to me, looking at it, it looks like it was more about somebody, like you said, feeling like they were in the best position to make the judgment call, but making what seems like a very wrong judgment call, and then refusing help for various reasons. So just to try to wrap this up a little bit, in the 80s and 90s, there kept on being claims. There was the 80s and 90s were a period where, because of advances in like submarine technology, and like there were, for instance, there was some very famous ships like the Bismarck and the Titanic were found underwater with submarines. So it was a period where people were starting to also look for other famous ships and missing things, and also treasure underwater and stuff like that. Like there's still people that find like old Spanish galleons filled with gold that were sunk by the British.
Oh yeah, I mean History Channel has like a whole show about that, right?
Yeah. So
it's actually
very
pretty interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's certainly worth as much of an investment as investing in like an oil well. So yeah, you're essentially digging for gold. So what was interesting was they kept on finding these Avenger bombers off the coast underwater, and they're like, we found it, we found the missing flight, and then they would run the serial numbers, and then no, it turns out that during the period that this base was operational as a training base, something like 94 different people died in training accidents off this base. So
whoa, that's crazy.
And that doesn't just think that's just the people that died. That doesn't even include the people that crashed an airplane and didn't die. A lot of airplanes crashed off the coast of this thing, and fortunately, especially in this era, when you're making a lot of airplanes, you're trying to train a lot of pilots at once, because, like you said, a lot of them are going to go right off into the war and get shot down and killed, and then you got to crank out more airplanes and more pilots, and it's a really big machine of training going on, and naval aviation is really dangerous. Yeah, and Florida is filled with just crazy weather. It's essentially Central American weather. With hurricanes and everything else. So there were a lot of planes that crashed off the coast, and they have never, to this day, found any of the airplanes definitively where they can point to a serial number on the airplane and say, oh, that's the airplane. So
well, that sort of leads to another, I guess, theory that's been floating around, and I'm not sure if you know where I'm going with this, but there's been some sort of UFO connections with Flight 19, and what are your thoughts on that? Because I haven't really researched in depth in terms of like the UFO connection here, but allegedly there had been like pilots during the World War II, especially on the German side, the Nazi fighter pilots, reporting, I guess, UFOs or like circular objects like hovering around where they were flying and moving in like sporadic directions really fast and unexplainably. So I mean, if a lot of people are reporting UFO sightings, I mean, could they all be just faking it? Could they all just be talking crap, or maybe something actually did happen? Who knows?
So for the other ones, I can't comment, or I am actually pretty supportive of a lot of the other UFO claims. There's another one that maybe we'll cover in the future about some famous airliner cases and other similar ones like that. We covered the Nimitz one, so I for sure believe that some amount of those sightings are real. In this case, I think if they had said that they saw something, that would have made me
Hmm.
maybe think that, at least kind of hope that it was something more interesting than that. And then there was kind of a fringe theory for a while that there's a famous Twilight Zone episode. There's a couple different versions of this Twilight Zone episode as they remade the Twilight Zone, where an airliner essentially, I think, jumps
Right.
back in time. So that was always kind of one of those other fringe theories, was that maybe because of the Bermuda Triangle weirdness, maybe they had somehow slipped into another dimension or another, and somehow the radio signals were
Right.
bridging.
Just to
Yeah.
make it clear, we're not talking about the Twilight Zone as in the vampire teenage, like the
Uh,
2009. Because like I
yeah.
was like,
No.
what are we talking about here? But yeah, we're not talking about that
No. I'm talking about
that thing. Yeah.
the famous sort of paranormal TV series that's really at least in the United States, is
Yeah.
really well known, even with the younger
Okay.
generations.
Okay.
I mean,
Because like
yeah.
I wasn't aware of it, and I was sort
Okay.
of thinking that you were talking about those
Yeah.
guys. But yeah.
Oh
Okay.
no, no, no. Yeah, no. Just when we say the Twilight Zone here, we kind of mean topics that straddle the paranormal, that have to
Okay.
do with
Yeah.
things like UFOs and alternate universes and magic and ghosts and things like that. So yeah, there was a theory for a while, especially when it was being kind of played up in the Bermuda Triangle books, that maybe
Yeah.
not just this flight, but a lot of the other disappearances with the
Hmm.
Bermuda Triangle, maybe there was some kind of rift between dimensions, and then that's how these things are getting lost. And I mean,
Or maybe
it's
they just
it's
flew into like a teleport, like what
yeah,
we're seeing from from this image right here.
which I mean, I still don't totally discount things like that could happen, because we don't really know. Like there are actual physics theories
Of
about like
course.
multiverses and things like that, and there have been. I guess the more time that passes, sometimes these things get proven, and sometimes you find out, gosh, this one book that I read that was so cool that talked about that. Well, it turned out the guy was lying, which is pretty sad. And
Hmm.
that was one of the things I kind of discovered with this topic with the Bermuda Triangle, unfortunately. But yeah, no, I think that was one of the thoughts was, if other things had been working in their favor, you would think, oh, well, maybe this could happen. And especially when you look at some of the other disappearances, like the Cyclops, um, and
Mm,
there were other alleged cases of airplanes that supposedly disappeared in front of people, some of which it turned out were not totally true. But that was one of the theories. Yeah, that maybe that happened. Here's my one frustration, I think, as we sort of get to the close of this topic,
yep.
because we've covered a lot of the explanations. I just
Hmm.
keep on thinking, gosh, there was another way. If Taylor really thought that he was just off to the south of Florida and over in the Keys, why didn't he go northwest? Like, do you know what I'm saying? So if he'd gone northwest, he
Hmm.
would have hit either the panhandle of Florida, or worst case scenario, maybe like Louisiana, if he had enough fuel. And like you know what I'm saying?
Northwest. Okay, so
So
in
if you're
in
down
his
there,
mind, we're talking about like what would have happened if he like in his like mind, why would he not go northwest? So right now
I
I'm trying
just
to
I guess
figure
he
out.
thought like I guess he thought that he was getting directly to the base by going northeast, but it was a big bet. It was like betting everything on black or something, in roulette. He, w-
Yeah.
that's what it was similar to. It was making a big bet in one particular solution,
Hmm. Yeah.
instead of picking a solution that was sort of halfway between his theory and the other theory.
That's interesting, right? Because if he was if he was really thinking that he was here, yeah, like why would he actually decide to go north?
Northeast, it's just doesn't seem to
Oh
be.
yeah, definitely. Like that's weird. Like why would he not go westward, right? Like that would
So,
in
so I
his
think
yeah.
I think he really thought he thought that he was, if you look at the tip of Florida there, the very tip,
Hmm.
he thought that he was like literally almost the complete opposite of where he was. So he thought he was probably to the southwest of Florida, and that he was cutting back towards the west coast of Florida.
Hmm.
That's where he was. That he was really that. I don't know how he thought he could be that much off course, but like I said, I think he was having a panic attack. And yeah, my
Hmm.
my question is, yeah, why not go northwest? And then you would hope you would see the coast out your window at some point. I mean, given some kind of high visibility, it just seems like a massive failure on his part. It's unfortunate, but I guess it really does go to show, even experts can be wrong. And yeah, as I was mentioning earlier, it is unfortunate because there were a lot of people in different stages of life. There was one of these guys was only 17 years old. He had joined at age 15 illegally under someone else's name. And then on the other hand, the captain I mentioned, I believe he was married. He was the only one I think that was married. But yeah, there were people that were combat veterans, or people that had like one of these guys had actually been in combat in the Pacific before this, like on the ground.
No,
I think.
crazy.
So yeah, it was just it's very unfortunate. And then look, one might ask, like, why didn't the Navy let all these other pilots go out there and help? But look, as soon as they did let someone else go up there, someone else blew up. Got killed. Yeah, it was tragic.
That's crazy. Right. So before we wrap up the episode, what is your opinion on the connection between like the two, I guess, flights that went missing? Like, okay, so the first flight we sort of talked about it. It was a misjudgment, and I guess ego may have played a part in that tragedy of Flight 19. But that other, I guess, a flight that was supposed to rescue them, like the airboat. Why did that sink? Like just like malfunctioning?
Bad luck. Yeah, just one of those things. Those things happen all the time, and sometimes two bad things happen at the same time. So one was because of somebody's judgment, and then I don't know how much in a hurry they launched those other two boats, but per the intro, just that plane had some other kind of mechanical issue. Yeah,
I mean, this I guess it could just be a coincidence, but at the same time, like, this definitely makes a case stronger for like something paranormal, that may had happened.
Yeah.
So I guess on this episode I'm leaning a little bit towards the paranormal, and you're like trying to give more rational explanations here, so it's like a little bit of a twist and turn in terms of like our usual like rationale, I guess. But yeah, so I mean,
because on the Nimitz episode I was so pro UFO, and certainly I still am on that case. But and this is one of the ones that if you talk to me when I was like a teenager, I would have said, oh, this is, it's mysterious and all these things. But then as, the internet kind of gets more materials out there to read, and then I find out some of these book authors lied, and then, etc. I remember even, just as a last note, I remember being even disappointed when they thought that they'd found the airplanes, because I was like, gosh, if they find the airplanes, that means it wasn't UFOs or it wasn't like, Dimension X, which is sort of sad. I mean, that's not really the right attitude, but now I'm like, now I would actually want them to find the airplanes, because
definitely. Right, I mean, so I guess this has been episode 21. We had done a, like a fairly long episode, I guess, around our usual time frame of, just over an hour. But I mean, this episode was really enjoyable for me. Maybe like even probably I probably enjoyed doing this episode like the most out of all of the episodes before, because I feel like, we kept it structured, and, we had made some improvements in the way we actually, how we flow the podcast. So I hope that we only get better at doing this in the future. And yeah, I really enjoyed talking about this topic with you today, Glenn. So, I mean, any final thoughts to our, listeners before we sign out as usual?
Yeah, well, I also enjoyed speaking with this as well with you, so I thank you as well. And thank you to all the subscribers. Our subscribing volume has increased, and our
views and watch time.
Our views have like tripled and almost quadrupled. So we're really getting steam. Thank you to everybody that subscribed.
Yep.
Thank you for your comments, and we hope to bring you another mystery in another week.
Yep, definitely. So this has been episode 21, the Solvable Mysteries podcast. Guys, definitely catch us on the next week's episode. And for this week, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. Please leave a comment down in the comment sections. What do you think about Flight 19? What are your theories on what actually happened? And we will see you on the next episode. Peace out and stay safe.